rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, bandiera rossa deve trionfar, e viva il comunismo e la libertà, avanti il popolo alla riscossa, bandiera rossa, bandiera rossa.
Okay, comrades, I'd like to welcome you all to this meeting organised by the Workers' International Network. We're happy to see comrades present from Britain, the USA, France, Sweden, Denmark, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Ireland, and maybe more countries too, all prominent activists in the labour movement. Internationalism has never been more essential than it is at this time. We're meeting at a crucial turning point in world history. So 1,000 people have died worldwide, and the total could reach millions. In Britain alone, the modest projection is for over 80,000 deaths. But this pandemic is just the start of the convulsions that will grip the planet. A prolonged economic slump, like that of the 1930s or even worse, lie across at least 35 countries, spread across 4 continents, with tens of thousands on the streets, braving tear gas and bullets and bringing governments crashing to their downfall. The plague and the lockdown have temporarily cut across this process, and there has been a sudden pause in the struggle. But these experiences have stripped bare the hopeless incapacity of capitalism to meet human needs or sustain human civilization and even the very survival of the species. So we can be sure of intensified turmoil and social unrest for years to come. We invite comrades who are not already subscribers to read our journal, On the Brink, and visit our website, which is www.onthebrink.online. We will be holding more Zoom meetings periodically, and we'll keep you all informed by email. We're proud to introduce today the Marxist economist, Michael Roberts, who writes the outstanding blog, www.thenextrecession.wordcom. He will explain the economic consequences of the pandemic. We've already circulated 15 questions to Michael, and of course you're welcome to raise in the course of the discussion. So, thank you. I think
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Here is Michael Roberts, bunkered down in the south of England, along with apparently 2.7 billion people under a lockdown across the world in some form or other at the moment. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes, will be to discuss the impact of the pandemic on the world economy and where it's going to lead us, and what policy measures can be adopted by governments to revive the economy or otherwise. But before I do that, I do want to just take a few minutes to discuss the virus itself, because on my blog and across Twitter and Facebook, I'm sure you're aware, there is a massive discussion about the risks of this virus, and there's quite a lot of what I might call virus skeptics out there who want to argue that basically this is a panic about nothing, a lockdown that was unnecessary, and that really the virus, first of all, is no worse than flu, and if we just let it go through the community in various countries, it will eventually reach a level of immunity, and deaths will be no higher than they would have been if we'd had a flu epidemic, which we get every winter. I mean, we can debate the science on this, but I don't want to spend too much time. I'm just going to give you my conclusions. People may disagree, particularly if there's any virus skeptics out there. First of all, as far as I can see, it is not like the flu. This coronavirus COVID-19 has an infection rate which is about 3 times higher than flu. It infects up to 3 people for every infection if it's not contained or the transmission is not suppressed. Secondly, on the very latest data that we can see, the mortality rate or the fatality rate is something like 0.6 of a total population to 1%, somewhere in between that, depending on the composition of the population that has been tested and analysed. The flu epidemic is about 0.1% in a fatality rate. So even at the most conservative measure, we're talking about a virus which kills 6 times more people than influenza if there is no containment, no control. And of course, the other factor above all in the case of this virus is that there's no vaccine, unlike influenzas, where we have a vaccine which is relatively effective. 50 to 60% of old people and others who take it every winter can avoid getting the flu as a result, although still half the population is at risk with the various flu mutations. So that's the first thing. Secondly, do we really want to just go for herd immunity? That is, we now know that it mainly affects 80% of old people, that is people my age and above, or people who've got sick and existing medical conditions. They are the most vulnerable to die. 80% of the deaths have been concentrated in this cohort, and therefore we should conclude that all the young people can go out, get infected, while we quarantine all the old people like me, lock me up, and give me social care and all the other support that I require if I'm on my own and all the rest of it, or not well. And eventually we'll get herd immunity, which is about 65% of the population, and then the virus will disappear, and we will be able to resume without a lockdown, without a collapse in an economy on this basis. Well, 2 things to say about that. No study has shown that it's possible to get to herd immunity very quickly or before we get a vaccine maybe next year. So going just for herd immunity and opening the doors and is really not going to solve the issue of this virus immediately anyway. Secondly, there is no country or government in the world who has yet been able to show how it could quarantine over 70s and sick people and look after them while the rest can carry on with their work. There just isn't the health and social care systems available in any country to achieve that. And the only way you can checking whether you've got to herd immunity is whether you're mass testing, contact and tracing, and the facilities in nearly every country in the world are way inadequate to achieve that. So the policy of herd immunity is not possible. There is even more the callous possibility of saying, well, it doesn't matter. Let the old people die. Let the sick people die. They're unproductive. They're unimportant to a capitalist economy. They don't produce any value worth having. In fact, they're a cost to the rest of us. So let them sweep away. Of course, that's not possible for governments to say, although I have to tell you, in various financial circles, that is a view that is quite prevalent, that really if we could get away with not having to do anything about it, then we would. That is why there's a continual pressure, of course, to return to exit strategies, as they're called, and to end these lockdowns. But could we have avoided the lockdowns? Yes, we could have avoided the lockdowns if we had proper social isolation and quarantining of the old, which I say was not possible. If we had mass testing and contact tracing to keep an eye on those people who are being infected, we had plenty of hospital capacity and ICUs and equipment and staff in all the various public health systems across the world, then we could have been perhaps in a position of helping to protect the elderly and the others and hospitalize them. In fact, what has happened, of course, we've seen is that social care is so poor in most countries that old people are dying in retirement homes in droves because there's just no way of protecting them given the inadequate social care system. So that solution, which was made possible perhaps in the case of South Korea perhaps Japan, perhaps New Zealand, is not possible for the vast majority of other countries who have just failed to be in that position. And even in the case of South Korea, New Zealand or Japan, they've had to introduce a fairly significant socialization and suppression techniques to try and get cases down. So a lockdown has been forced upon all these governments and on us because of the inadequacy of health systems and the lack of preparation for these pandemics that were going to happen. The degree of lockdown varies, and the Swedish argue that they can have a light lockdown where there isn't, people can still go to work, shops are still open, but all people stay at home and there are no mass events and people keep 6 feet apart from each other. We shall see whether the Swedish light lockdown works. All I can say is the virus skeptics say it's working brilliantly and Sweden has no cases. I look at the figures every day and I can tell you Sweden's cases are going up and their deaths are going up and the rate of deaths are going up. It's going to come up and match all those other countries that have major lockdowns by the time we get into the latter part of this summer. So in my view, the governments have been forced into these lockdowns because they have to show they want to protect the population. But as a result, they have entered a period where it's just incredible level of supply shock upon the world economy. As I say, nearly 3 billion people locked down in some form or another to avoid what would have been something like 40 to 50 million deaths if they'd done absolutely nothing. Containment and the lockdown has driven those figures down, still bad, but way, way down from what would happen if the virus had just been allowed to run. So that's my argument about whether the lockdowns are necessary and the seriousness of the pandemic itself. So let's consider the impact of the lockdown. And this is where I'm just trying to connect, if I can, my proposals here. I'm just going to share a screen and you should be able to see that, I hope. I'm hoping everybody can see that screen in some way if you can't. But here is my look at the nature of this economy in the pandemic. We've just come now to the end of the longest economic expansion in over 100 years in the US and the major economies. What I mean by expansion is after each slump that capitalism has suffered, there's a period of recovery. This particular slump, the last one, was the Great Recession of 2008-9, and actually it's now been just over 10 years, coming on 11, before this pandemic hit, that we have come to the end of the expansion. A very, very long time by historical standards, but also one of the weakest recoveries in the history of capitalism, in fact, the weakest in the post-war period. And as a result, we've seen very poor growth, poor investment, poor increases in wages, if at all, in many countries. And despite higher employment in some countries, it's really been very fragile, precarious sorts of unemployment. And really, the global economy, capitalist economy, has had a very, very weak period, despite how long it's lasted. But just as we get to the pandemic, it was already beginning to slow down. The blue and red lines demonstrate the slowdowns taking place in the two major sectors of the world economy before the pandemic came. And then we get the lockdowns and the closure of up to 1/3 to 40% of industry and even more in services across the board, leading to a collapse, a global economy going over the cliff. And the cumulative decline of that, in case of the US, for example, estimated by the IMF, is that over this year and next, the cumulative loss in GDP will be something like over 9% of GDP, way more than it was in the Great Recession. That's a cumulative decline. That means that 9% will never be recovered. It's lost. It's gone. Even if you go back to growth of 2% or 3% in the major economies and elsewhere, the period of decline, like a hole, like hole in the ground is not going to be filled. You just have to come out the other side and carry on. That's a loss of income, employment, and opportunities for people over 2 years and maybe longer in just that period. That's just over the next 2 years. And we've already seen a dramatic collapse also in trade and commodity prices, which is affecting not just the major economies, but in particular is affecting the so-called emerging markets, the so-called developing economies, which depend a great deal on trade, particularly trade in commodities like energy, agricultural products, industrial metals, all sorts of staples used by the more industrialized and more richer service economies for growing. And the prices of these things have collapsed because the lockdowns there, trade has collapsed. It was already slowing down, and this has now demonstrated how severely. And we see, for example, the oil price is in particular have imploded to levels, well, just briefly last couple of weeks, it actually went to zero on the prospects of buying for the next period of a month. And the price on the whole is averaging something like 60 or 70% below where it was before the pandemic began. And that's really going to hit energy companies, fossil fuel companies, we'll come to that later. And of course, and the reason is obvious, apart from the fact that the lockdown is there, it means that there's nobody moving around, transport is not taking place on the whole apart from deliveries. Industries are not using energy, they're the biggest user of energy and the biggest carbon emitter, they're not using it. Airlines are not using any of the airline fuel and so on, so the oil price is collapsing because there's just no demand. And if we look at this measure by the IMF, it reckons that emerging markets, for the first time ever that been recorded, will actually have negative growth in 2020. Now, what do we mean by emerging markets? We mean all those economies that are not part of the G7, some of them in the G20, not the non-imperialist countries, the countries in particular like, for example, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Argentina, Turkey, Indonesia. These countries usually grow at anything between 3 and 5%. In the case of China, more like 6 to 10%. Now, including China, the IMF is estimating that all these economies will have negative growth this year, but it's never had. This is going to be cataclysmic for the impact upon incomes and employment in all these countries. In the case of Europe, for example, the Eurostat and financial organizations looked at the collapse in production, which they expect in the euro area GDP during 2020, dropping by as much as 17% by the end of the year. And then the recovery appearing to be steep, but then not really getting through very fast after next year. And in fact, we will, according to this estimate, the euro area GDP will not return to the previous level of GDP in real terms until well into 2024. This is a deep, long recession, you might call depression, for Europe ahead. And in fact, that's one of my arguments in the book I wrote in 2016, The Long Depression, in which I argued that end of the Great Recession was not going to lead to a V-shaped recovery, a fast recovery for capitalism to grow at faster rates, having cleansed itself in the Great Recession, that for various reasons, which we have time to discuss, it was not able to return to that sort of growth that even seen before 2007. If you look at the right-hand top corner of this particular schematic diagram from the book, you can see that a depression takes the form of a drop away, but not a V-shaped recovery, but a very sort of square root type recovery where it stays below trend for a very, very long time, which is basically what the previous graph was showing from the Mora and Eurostat. And we've had such depressionary environments like that back in the 19th century, in the Great Depression, and in my view, since 2007 now. So this pandemic is going to, which we should discuss in a moment, going to offer a new leg, perhaps, in that depression. If we see what happened between 1947 and 2007, it's really staggering how clear the long depression is, that the trend growth rate for major economies in per capita terms of GDP on that trend line, all the way up and down with little ups and downs depending on booms and slumps. But from 2007 and the Great Recession, it has made no return to the previous trend whatsoever. There's a gap widening. That gap between the dotted line and the line of actual growth is lost output, employment and income that otherwise should have been there without this depression, gone forever, not able to provide the resources that the productive forces that supposedly capitalism can. And here's an estimate by the World Trade Organization of what's happened to trade. As you can see, up to 2008, it was going out at a reasonable pace. In fact, it outstripped growth on the whole. Then we get the slump in 2009, and we see that there's a big drop. There's a relative recovery, but we're now on the yellow dotted line tells you the trend of world trade after that, a huge gap between where it was before. Now we hit the pandemic. You have two scenarios in the World Trade Organization, a relatively optimistic one, which suggests after this lockdown and slump, we will return to previous growth rates post 2009, or even worse, we will now enter an even lower trajectory in world trade. And as perhaps we can discuss later, that's a real indicator that perhaps globalization, as has been talked about, of growth of capitalist accumulation across the world based on globalized trade and movement of capital is really in a much more difficult and threatened position from here. That brings me to the question of what governments can do about it. Can governments do anything about this? Well, there are two main policies that governments have. That is to pump in as much credit, money if you like, in order to provide support for business in particular, but even for households in this particular crisis, so that there is sufficient funding while the pandemic lasts and the lockdown continues, so that eventually when that's over, they'll be able to, companies, businesses will be able to come out and resume growth at perhaps the same level of employment, make the same levels of investment, and not be left with an impossible task of restoring their corporate health. So but to do that through money and credit policy, means that the central banks have got to start pumping in huge amounts of money. Here is the measurement of the Federal Reserve in the US purchases of treasuries. This is the way that you can give money to the government. The Federal Reserve buys all up the government's bonds in order to pump money into the government so that the government can then spend it on all the plans it's got either to help businesses or households. And you can see it's a massively larger figure on a weekly basis than even was the case in previous what's called quantitative easing injections of credit than we have. But this is, to use the current word that is now so popular in this subject, unprecedented. And we have unprecedented injections of credit by the Fed and other central banks. And then there is the government side, that funding, purchases of bonds from the banks, puts money into the banks, but also the US Congress and other governments can put money, can just borrow money themselves, issue even more treasury, or as I will discuss in a minute, perhaps just get central bank money in order to start spending to keep the economy from collapsing down the hole. So we have various funds being authorized by Congress, more each day, again, unprecedented levels of trillions of dollars now in order to either give households cash in their pocket to get through, businesses grants to get through, loans to airlines and other big companies closed down, and also to keep the banks from collapsing as well. So there's a massive injection from the fiscal level, as it's called, from government to try and keep the economies going. This is the biggest spend in history. Here is my own particular estimate of fiscal packages as a percentage of GDP as of a couple of weeks ago from various governments across the world. So we can see something like anything between 11% of GDP down to 1%, but the average works out at around about 4 to 5% of GDP. Injection of funds directly, various packages of government spending by governments across the world. In the Great Recession, the government spending packages eventually accumulated to 2% of world GDP at that time. So we're talking about an average fiscal package now across the world, which is twice as large as it was in the Great Recession in order to combat this lockdown and the collapse in the world economy. So that's an indication of how much effort, to the limit, that capitalist governments are going with their two wings of, two arrows, if you like, of policy weapons, money and fiscal, in order to try and keep this capitalist economy afloat. Meanwhile, the virus, of course, is killing capitalism with the lockdown. But I don't think this is going to turn, when the pandemic is over and the lockdowns are over, I don't think this injection of funds may hold people's incomes just about at home, may just keep enough businesses ticking over, but it's not going to be enough to cause a big increase in growth and investment and employment after the pandemic is over. I think it's just not enough, and I'll explain why. First of all, the profitability of the private sector, the capitalist sector, which really matters in capitalist economies, is at very low levels. Here is a measure of the G7 internal rate of return on capital. The source for this is the Penn World Tables of 9.1, where they had this new series, the internal rate of return on capital. Saves a lot of time working out profitability on your own, but it's still not exactly the same as the Marxist definition, but it certainly is a good proxy. And you can see that we're at quite low levels in the G7 for profitability in this depressionary period. So that means that investment stays low, productivity stays low, and therefore the ability to improve wages for workers also is weak. The productive forces are not being developed because profitability under capitalism remains very low. And if we look at the mass of profit, not the profit rate, the total profits in the corporate sectors of the 6 major economies, my own particular calculation, we can see that the growth in the corporate profits before the virus came was already close to zero. And of course, is obviously going to be negative as we go through 2020. It was heading into the zero land, and so that all the big corporate companies were, apart from the very top elite that we know about, the ones that were always in the papers, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, etc., Apple, all these companies obviously are making big profits, but the vast swathe of capitalist companies are not doing so. In fact, their only way of surviving by increasing the amount of debt that they've got in order to keep business moving forward. So we see a big increase in corporate debt in the non-financial sector across the world. These are IMF figures, and we'll see that we're round about non-corporate debt, financial corporate debt is now over 90% of GDP in mature markets and emerging markets. That is a record high, which means that there's a tremendous weight of debt on companies if they come out of this pandemic. Low profitability, profits poor, profits have been destroyed, how will they get back up again? And yet they've still got a lot of debt, which is not being written off. All that's happened is that they can take more debt or they can get grants to get them through the lockdown, but their legacy debt remains there and it has to be paid. The reason they've been able to service it up to now, of course, is because interest rates are so incredibly low that the service costs on this debt is relatively low, enables many, many companies to survive. But if there is any shift in the interest rates over the next 3 or 4 years, it's always a big risk, and then loads of companies, which we call zombie companies, that just survive on, just service their debt and keep going, could go to the wall, and that would have, the estimate in Europe and the US is that's between 10 and 20% of companies could be in a position where we would see a whole series of bankruptcies. In my view, lots of companies have gone into this lockdown and pandemic are not going to come out of it at the other side. They are going to disappear as a result of the pressures of debt, profitability, and the inability to survive because they were on the edge anyway. So my view, the fiscal and monetary injections won't work. And if we look at the lessons of the Great Depression in the 1930s, it was also clear that pumping in funds, which wasn't actually done very much, or huge amounts of monetary credit injections did not work. Keynes actually started with the idea of quantitative easing in the early 30s. By the time he wrote General Theory, he dropped quantitative easing and said it wasn't working. Then he proposed fiscal spending as a solution. But as he says in this quote, it seems politically impossible for a democracy to organise the expenditure on the scale necessary to bring about a recovery in the economy, except in war conditions. In other words, where governments can intervene and and control the investment and employment and production activities of the capitalist sector. A recent paper by Bossy and Mason makes the same point, that unless there's a massive rapid shift towards civilian production, or as it used to be military, in order a conscious direction to boost planning and to make investment under the control of government planning and direction, then if it's left to the capitalist economy to recover the economy, then we're going to be waiting a long time for the capitalist sector to do that. A world economy in that sense is perhaps the only way that things could be turned around. Otherwise, we're going to stay as we are. Here is a figure I produced many years ago, which shows the impact of government investment in the US during the Great Depression. You can see that the private investment growth rate was incredibly low and didn't make any attempt to restore the economy in the period between the 1930s, during the 1930s. It's only when governments intervened, replaced the capitalist sector with direct investment and government control in the war, which was a war economy, in order to achieve a big task. Then, if we had to get out of the pandemic lockdown, if you like, say, we need that sort of approach and policy. Then, as a transformation, government investment rocketed up, and actually the US war economy then made a big recovery. So I'd like to, because I see a number of the questions that were sent to me in advance, so I'd just like to do a very quick analysis of the difference between Keynesian policies and what I consider are the policies that should be socialist. It's a bit small writing, but I hope you can read it. Keynesian policies are to run budget deficits and raise government spending to boost demand, not profitability, because that's not in Keynes's mind. Hand cash grants and loans to households to spend, businesses to invest. The first part, to households, is what we see in this particular Keynesian spending spree, which hasn't been done before. Start public works programs to achieve full employment. You know, the old thing that Keynes said, as long as there's people out digging holes and filling them up again, that creates demand and can produce employment. Government should do that. Coordinate all these measures through the IMF, the World Bank and the UN to make sure there's an international coordination using the international agencies to do that. Well, that's it. That's the Keynesian plan. I could just say that we've covered some of those points about whether they would work, but the coordination internationally is just not going to happen. The IMF can't raise any more funds out of the US and Europe to spread around. The World Bank is the same. The IMF and the World Bank have done nothing about cancelling the debt of emerging economies. We're so seriously in difficulty now and will probably default across the board unless something's done. There is no coordination taking place on an international level of any form in order to expand the opportunities to boost investment and get public works and programs going. Marx's view is, yes, we should hand cash investments out, but we should bypass the banks. It should go directly to households and social benefits to the unemployed, disabled, and we should take over the big banks and major multinationals, essential to planning for us, so that we can really organise recovery in this, both in the pandemic and afterwards. So things like delivery companies. Amazon is making $10,000 a second. And this company is totally private in the hands of a few shareholders. Bezos is making billions every week as a result of the expansion of Amazon and so on. Social media, broadband, leisure, airlines, railroad companies. What more is necessary for socialisation of these sectors of the economy so that we can direct the resources and organise those resources in the most effective way possible and get the value out of those companies to use to help everybody else. Yes, we need directly employed publicly invested programs for climate change, the environment, and so on. And we need investment in pharmaceuticals and medicine and the health system to ensure that this pandemic is not repeated, or the results of it are not repeated, because we're going to get more of these pathogens coming through. So that's why we need free universal public services like health and education, and start to spread to other sectors where we have free at the point of use in order to meet. So you might want universal basic income for the period of the lockdown, but what you want is universal basic services for the period of the recovery and the growth of the economy. And as I say, we need to cancel the debts for the developing economies and have an internationally coordinated plan to deal with global warming, the fossil fuel companies, the agro companies, and the reorganization of a world economy that's not destroying nature and delivering these pathogens back to us, but is organized in harmony with nature and also with the needs of the people themselves. Finally, Chair, I just want to talk about one of the other questions raised. Are we going into a long depression, or will, because of all the collapse of various capitalist countries, it will create the conditions for increased profitability and then a capitalist boom? I think it's most likely the former. Fiscal and monetary injections will keep many zombie companies going, but with only more debt. Reduced trade and investment flows will probably keep profitability low. It's going to be difficult to turn that round without socializing them. New technologies are not going to infuse quickly in this environment, which is the environment of creative destruction, which Schumpeter have talked about. You might say Marx talked about in terms of recovery after a slump. That doesn't seem to be, there's plenty of new technologies out there, but will they infuse through the economy in this environment? And emerging economies are going to be seriously depressed unless China recovers to so much that it can stimulate and help those economies. And that remains perhaps an open question. So those are my points. I've probably missed a lot of the questions that people have asked for, but I hope it's helped to start the discussion.
Michael, thank you very much for your very, very knowledgeable take on the COVID-19 crisis. All right, I'm going to call people in now, and I have written down, I'll start with Trish. No, sorry, iPad 5. Did you have your hand up? Because it's indicated on my list. I don't know who iPad 5 is, but if you'd like to start speaking, even if it's to say, no, I don't want to come in. All right. Trish, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I feel a little, I didn't realise I'd be first. It's a bit scary because I don't really understand economics very well, Michael, but that was fantastic. Thank you. What I will say, or ask, not say, I just want to ask, why is it that we have to measure success as a species by growth? Is there not a way that we can measure success by how we share resources rather than growing? I don't understand the kind of GDP need, the growth. I feel like it's like we're spreading rather than trying to reduce all of our expenditure and use of resources. I know that might sound really stupid.
I had it on mute.
Huh?
I had it on mute.
Michael, do you want to answer individual questions or take a group?
What do you think is the best way to do it, Dave? Would you take the 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah, let's try it that way.
Otherwise, I could moan on it for every question for half an hour and then the other people never get in.
Yeah, that's fine. Actually, Trish, that was a brilliant question because my economics is not very good. And I wrote down about GDP. So don't worry about if your knowledge of economics is pretty poor. No one here is going to criticize you. You come out and ask this is your opportunity, really. And given Michael's also talked about international socialism, there's our opportunity to say, well, how would that actually work? Not many of us will be economists. So,
Sono i confini, rosse bandiere, o proletari alla riscossa, bandiera rossa.